What is a presidential covert action finding? This is the technicality that he's authorized the use of U.S. military forces in Ukraine. So what the hell is this?
I'll tell you what it is. It's a way to not get congressional approval to go to war.
Well, of course.
Which we don't even do anymore. We don't even pretend.
So Michael Tracy explains this in a tweet this afternoon. He says, I wonder if we'll ever get to see a copy of Biden's presidential covert action finding authorizing secret U.S. military operations in Ukraine, or if there's another John Poindexter running around who's determined to make sure we never get to see it. Of course, what he's referring to there is John Poindexter, who worked under was the national security advisor to Ronald Reagan, who ripped it up when it was being used for the Iran-Contra, to Reagan's justification for sending arms to the Iranians in the Iran-Contra scandal. We invited excellent independent journalist Michael Tracy on the show to unpack this a little further. So, Michael, I was, I wish I would say I was surprised by this report, but I'm not at all. A sizable number of U.S. forces operating in Ukraine from the start of the war and probably previous to that. What was your response upon seeing this report?
Well, since the moment the war started, I've seen speculation to this effect that there was just assumed to be a presence of American special forces or American personnel of some kind that were on the ground in Ukraine. Now, we did know that there had been a public deployment of actually the Florida National Guard in Ukraine prior to the war. That was a long-term deployment for, quote unquote, training purposes. And what was claimed in February is that that unit or units of the Florida National Guard that had been deployed to Ukraine for training had been withdrawn in anticipation of the Russian invasion, because the idea was the U.S. did not want its forces to be in direct combat with Russia. Certainly, Joe Biden repeatedly pledged really, that he would not deploy American forces to take part in direct combat against Russia, hence that withdrawal of the National Guard unit. But even aside from that, the internet was flush with speculation that, you just kind of just assume in these sorts of situations that there would probably be some sort of covert or, stealth American military presence. Now, I had been looking for months to see if I could get any kind of hard verification of it, hard reporting of it. In April, there was a hard report in the Times, the newspaper in the UK, that a British special forces deployment was physically in Ukraine as of April.
Right, and we've seen videos of that.
If there's, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to really be sure what's being depicted on a video. All I know is that for sure there was a report in April in the Times, which is, a very credible newspaper in London, that there was a special forces unit of the UK military in Ukraine physically, on the ground, boots on the ground, so to say. Now, what do you infer from that? Well, most of the time, the UK military does what it does in tandem with the U.S. military. It really operates as a subsidiary, much of the time, of the U.S. military. So you might expect that if there was this on-the-ground, boots-on-the-ground presence of the UK military, something might be happening likewise with the U.S., but there was no hard verification of that, really, as far as I could tell. You kind of just have to maybe surmise things or infer things. But then yesterday, for the first time that I'm aware of, the Intercept did report, and it's strange because they didn't actually emphasize this in the headline.
Right.
Which you'd think they would. They kind of buried it because they were emphasizing other aspects of the sort of intelligence that they had been made privy to on the, what the U.S. anticipated as to the efficacy of the Russian invasion. I would have personally probably emphasized this part, which is that there have been continuously since the onset of the war, a special forces deployment to inside physically to Ukraine. Now, they don't specify what those special forces have been doing. They don't say whether they've been engaged in combat or not. They don't say really anything at all about what they've been up to. But what would they be up to in a war zone? I don't know. You tell me. And so, I think it's confirmation of what a lot of people had reasonably suspected, but because of the just very conspicuous dearth of reliable reporting on this war since it began, there hasn't been a whole lot of interest in sussing out these sorts of details.
Yeah.
There's sort of like a moral prohibition, in a way, on genuinely adversarial reporting around U.S. policy in Ukraine, because many people in the media, in the think tank world, in the political class, and so forth, they're convinced in the unalterable moral sacrosanctity of this intervention, and so they think if there's some sort of an affront to take a critical or adversarial journalistic posture toward it. Now, I don't think that's healthy at all. I mean, it's ridiculous that it took 7-8 months for this information to come out in plain text when it was the case all along.
Do you think that I mean, certainly seems intentional?
Not that the Intercept was not reputable, but you think it would have been more widespread knowledge at this point.
It seemed like this was absolutely intentional. I mean, we've heard definitely reports from Western media, imperial Western media like CNN, et cetera, who reported on the blackouts, not being able to get to the front lines on the part of Ukraine, keeping reporters away from the Ukrainian side. Is it, in large part, do you believe they'd be up there? They'd be able to walk right up and see Americans there. CNN reporter, hey, hey, I reckon, here you are. You're Americans. I'm an American. I'm from CNN. Oh, well, you can't mention that on television. So we don't want you anywhere near these front lines.
It's hard to say if that would be the reason why there would be these measures to prevent access to sort of embedded units, which, that's what was done during the Iraq War. That was done, famously during the Gulf War, where everything was broadcast, simultaneously on CNN from these embedded reporters. And there are problems with the ethics of embedded reporters to begin with.
Right.
But yeah, the total lack of it, seemingly, some indication that there was information control that was pretty stringent, at the very least, on the part of the ruling authorities. The first insight I really got into this that was vivid was a report from this journalist, Seth Harp, who did a big article for Harper's Magazine, I want to say in June or July, but he was there in March, April in Ukraine. And he said basically what the reporters were doing was sitting in the hotel room and going to briefings by the Ukraine Defense Ministry, and then that was being conveyed and repackaged into news articles. I mean, that's mostly what they're doing. Not exclusively, I'm sure. I'm sure you could find counterexamples, but that was a large percentage of the supposed, on the ground, intrepid reporting that was being done. So it's not surprising that there would be massive blind spots. When I was on the Ukraine border in March in Poland, this is sort of a small facet of this in the grand scheme of things, but it just so happened that at a processing center for displaced Ukrainians, mostly women and children who had come over the border to Poland, I happened to just encounter an American man in military fatigues wandering around who told me, and he gave a credible account that he actually had been in this giant military complex in Yavoriv, which was struck by a huge Russian aerial bombardment a few days prior. And I only raised that because when John Kirby, who was then the spokesperson for the Pentagon, was asked about that incident, he said no Americans were affected. And yet here's an American telling me personally that not only was he affected, he was in the bombing, he was injured by flying shattered glass, and he said that he was nearly killed. If he had just been positioned slightly differently on his bed, he would have been basically impaled by the shards of glass and killed.
Wow.
And so that totally contradicts what Kirby said. So, I mean, that's the attitude you have to take toward a lot of this. So much is being obscured, whether deliberately or not, that it's really hard to draw any firm conclusions about much of anything until you get hard proof.
Well, speaking of John Kirby, we heard from former, if you're in the same, they probably hang out together, former CIA director, former four-star general David Petraeus, who's been on a media tour over the past week, clearly being pushed out there by the Biden-Obama lackeys, trying to drum up more support for this. He was interviewed in an exclusive interview. I believe this one was on ABC. I forget. He's done so many of these interviews recently, where he said, it seemed like unequivocally, no, U.S. boots are not on the ground. U.S. boots are not on the ground. Maybe some of our allies have boots on the ground, referring to the UK and others, but we are not. Let's play that sound, but I want to get you to respond.
We're not going to put boots on the ground. That doesn't mean there may not be other capabilities, or that there may not be some of our closest allies with boots on the ground, everyone working together.
Okay, so do you hear something different there? Like, it seemed to me like he's saying, no, U.S. was not there. We're not there. But do you hear that differently?
David Petraeus is a very skilled practitioner of public communications, as you might expect for someone who was director of the CIA, even though he had to, leave that post somewhat ignominiously.
Right.
And, as the, architect of U.S. military strategy in Afghanistan and Iraq, did all kinds of public testimonies and went before Congress and so forth. So he's practiced at this. I didn't take what he said there to be a flat denial that any quote unquote boots are on the ground, meaning that any U.S. military personnel are on the ground in Ukraine. I took him to be basically restating what the Biden administration's stated policy is, which is that no boots on the ground will be in Ukraine. But again, the reason why they use that term is because it's so incredibly vague. Barack Obama said there will be no boots on the ground in Syria at the beginning of the intervention against ISIS, supposedly in 2014. And, soon enough, there were not just boots on the ground, but U.S. military personnel were sustaining casualties. So when they talk about boots on the ground, do they mean, U.S. Army soldiers? Because they're the only ones in the U.S. military who wear boots.
Right, infantry.
I think it's sort of a distraction or a deflection, right? I mean, if there are U.S. military personnel on the ground in Ukraine, as has now been reported by the Intercept, seemingly corroborated, they've even provided the presidential covert action finding that Biden apparently signed in secret to authorize this operation.
I wanted to ask you about that. So
presumably those personnel are wearing boots, right? So right. I mean, ultimately, the whole boots on the ground sort of mantra is sort of a deliberate obfuscation.
Let's talk about this presidential covert action finding. If anybody watching right now who's not a student of history might not be aware of what this phrase means and how it's been used in history, I was surprised to read this in this report also, that this is how President Biden was using this in order to justify putting boots on the ground inside Ukraine, the presidential covert action finding. What is this? How has it been used before? And what power does it give the presidency?
Well, it's a pretty obscure mechanism, as you might expect for a mechanism that's intended to be kept secret, to authorize secret operations.
Right.
According to the Intercept report, this finding, that's what they call it, really you just call it an order. It's sort of a presidential assertion of power, originated during the Obama administration, the Obama-Biden administration, when apparently Obama signed some order to this effect to counter sort of Russian influence activities, which is a very vague term. It immediately struck me that sounds like a term that would have been used to describe measures taken to counteract like so-called Russian interference, like online trolls or memes or the stuff associated with like the Russiagate narrative circa the 2016 election. But I'm not 100% sure on that. That's what I read when I see that. But, we would need more information, or we would need like the exact text of the document, which is probably not going to be forthcoming for some time. But, Biden apparently is now using that Obama era version of this decree or assertion of power to authorize active war operations with an on the ground military deployment in Ukraine. And now, we, the public, have no ability to actually scrutinize the text of that document to see if it accords with what's actually happening on the ground, because we're not even being told what's happening on the ground. It's coming out in these bits and pieces and, vague increments. And yeah, I mean, this is a very obscure order, again, for a reason. That there's one of the most famous instances of an order like this being issued was by Ronald Reagan in December of 1985, when he issued one of these, findings to authorize the, what was then the technically illegal shipment of arms to Iran, right, as part of what came to be later known as the Iran-Contra affair. And the document that Reagan signed authorizing this secretly was then later destroyed by his National Security Advisor, John Poindexter, who then got prosecuted criminally for that.
Yeah, and admitted to it, admitted to destroying.
It's a huge deluge of secrecy that these orders fall under. And so it's unclear if we'll ever get to see what Biden actually signed off on.
So do you think the mainstream media, I mean, the mainstream media has, of course, been holding a very close lens to what the U.S. has been doing in Ukraine. I say that facetiously, of course. Do you think there will be front page stories, CNN.com coverage in nightly newscasts, bombshell report, U.S. forces in Ukraine? Or will this just get swept under the rug and ignored?
Okay, so right now we're in a situation where just yesterday the New York Times reports that the U.S. intelligence agencies believe that the Ukraine government carried out an assassination car bomb attack just outside of Moscow in August on a prominent Russian, philosopher's daughter.
Right.
That's what the U.S. intelligence services say they believe, according to the New York Times. On top of that, there is an emerging consensus among, fairly reputable analysts, media outlets, even very hawkish media outlets, like, the Dispatch. They're all putting out articles and proclamations saying that the risk that the U.S. the U.S. and the world now faces from nuclear destruction is as high as it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago. So we have that. And on top of that, we now have the first confirmation that there are boots on the ground in Ukraine. And the U.S. is not just operationally coordinating and subsidizing the war effort against the world's largest nuclear armed power. They're engaging in physical execution of it in the war zone itself, which had never been, at least to my knowledge, acknowledged so openly until this article came out yesterday. So that's a hugely combustible combination of events that you'd think would merit some, front page, so to say,
right,
coverage or commentary. And, I tend to think that instead we'll get a whole lot of, never-ending recriminations about January 6th instead. That's the more pressing issue for much of the media.
Yeah, it's really stunning, of course, the media silence on all of this. Again, we'll see. We'll keep our eyes on this to see what sort of additional reporting comes out of this. We'll have to wait 6 months until the New York Times confirms this Intercept piece. And then that's when the media will pay attention to it as if it's, just like the Hunter Biden story. We need the New York Times 2 years later to verify the authenticity of a story before we can talk about it, I suppose.
Well, remember, even just earlier this year, when suddenly this major Russian warship gets sunk, right? And everybody's saying, "Rah rah! Look at the ingenuity of the Ukrainians. They're doing such an amazing job. We underestimated their tenacity. It's such a wonderful, inspiring story of what a military force can do under the most dire of conditions." And then the New York Times then eventually, afterwards, lets us all know that, oh, by the way, it was actually operationally coordinated by the U.S., the sinking of this Russian flagship.
Right.
So yeah, that's the pattern. We don't get told anything of significance usually in real time, and we all just have to kind of read tea leaves until the New York Times can be bothered to tell us about the secrets whispered to them that are probably incomplete themselves from different intelligence communities, agency sources.
Right. And we've been saying on our show for months, and according to our sources, NATO is actively involved in this war, absolutely actively involved in this war. NATO is at war with Russia. We are at war with Russia. And I just don't think people really are aware of how consequential that is.
I was, when the war started, I went to the border in Poland, and I went to physically the new military installation that the U.S. had constructed in Yeshiv at this airport facility where they were. This was the U.S. This is from where the U.S. was organizing the deployment of huge amounts of armament into a war zone, and it was all shut off from any kind of media scrutiny. You can't, to this day, to my knowledge, you can't. No journalist has actually examined any of this new military infrastructure that's been constructed. Now, I tried to catch glimpses of stuff here and there, or see trucks going in and out, or things being handed off. But it's a massive operation. And in fact, the U.S. they just announced this at the NATO conference in June, which I also went to in Madrid, that the U.S. is going to be making a base permanent in Poland now.
Right.
And so the idea that that was the end of it, or like where our knowledge of what is involved in this massive scale military operation was complete, was also always just preposterous. And yet, that's not how the situation tends to be portrayed in the media. The media have this sort of like euphoric, joy around, supporting Ukraine or screaming Slava Ukraini or whatever. And that's basically the extent of their, dispassionate analysis of the situation.
And now Poland asking for the United States will just share its nuclear weapons, like a 5-year-old sharing a Thomas the Tank Engine with their friends. So nuclear weapons about to be perhaps shipped to Poland next, on loan perhaps. Who knows? Michael, where can people...
what was what's the commonly understood to be the precipitating event of the Cuban Missile Crisis? It was Soviets wanting to bring Russia nuclear warheads into Cuba, right? Right near the United States landmass.
Right.
Well, Poland's pretty close to Ukraine. It's on the border, actually.
Yeah, but where, Michael, they don't have an all-important document like the Monroe Doctrine to stop it. Right. So they can't just point to some arbitrary document from the 1700s that will get us to remove nuclear weapons from their borders.
I'm sure James Monroe anticipated all this.
Right, exactly. Michael, where can people learn? Michael's a great writer and a great thinker. We often quote Michael here on the show and feature your tweets. So you're very active on Twitter. Is there someplace else people can find out your great journalism? We need more journalists like you, by the way.
Thanks. With Twitter, M Tracy, probably too active at times, but I try to reel it in. And Substacks, mtracy.substack.com. I have a new piece out coming out today.
Oh, great. We'll link it up here in the description. People go read Michael's work. Michael, we really appreciate you joining us. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks.
So this is the stage we're in right now. This is the elevation of tensions. I mean, we've got the United States actively, multiple reports now with U.S. forces actively there, and not just a small contingent, but actively in charge of the heavy weapons. This is, of course, as we had David Petraeus here, a total lie on the part of David Petraeus,
right?
Telling us that no, there's no active boots on the ground by the United States in Ukraine. Nothing at all. Nothing to see here.
Yeah. It's really shocking, and it feels just like massive escalation right as we speak, but it's not. It has been all along, as we've been sold a bill of goods.
Well, they keep lying to us, so they continue to